Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jack McDevitt. I'm the director of the Institute for Race and Justice at Northeastern, and I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon in what is going to be a fascinating and important conversation. This is the latest in a series of conversations that we've called Race and Community Dialogue, that's sponsored by the Institute for Race and Justice, the Violence Justice Research Lab, and the Community Advisory Board. And we started this last year out of a demand for more opportunities for people to talk about issues that were current. And last year we had one series was on race and policing in immigrant communities. Our second one was on police and youth of color. And the third one was a discussion of the Netflix documentary Trial 4 that dealt with the continuing trials and the 22 years of imprisonment of Sean Ellis for a crime that he eventually got released for. This afternoon session, as I said, is going to be important as we think about coming back to full employment in this economy. This session is co-sponsored by the MassHire, the Boston Career Center, by the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, and the College of Social Science and Humanities here at Northeastern. Today's conversation will address issues facing people who are returning to work following the pandemic, and particularly how some of the challenges that they face are different for different communities and communities of color. In a preliminary conversation that we had, all of the people on the panel, I have to tell you, I was so impressed with the wealth of experience and knowledge and compassion they all showed for how to deal with the issue of bringing people back into the workforce after such a strange and amazing time we've all been through. I'm looking forward to this dialogue quite a bit. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Amy Farrell. Amy is the director of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice here at Northeastern, the first woman to direct the school, which is incredibly important. Amy is an internationally known scholar in the area of human trafficking, and her research looks at, across a wide variety of criminal justice agencies, how agencies deal with complexity and deal with the complex charges we give them. So it's my honor to turn it over to Amy.
Thank you very much, Jack. That's a very nice introduction. And welcome to everybody at the Northeastern community and beyond to our second year of this exciting dialogue series. I'm very pleased to be introducing handing off the introductions this afternoon for this amazing panel that we have to talk about a really important issue facing communities across the country, which are the ways in which people return to work, the ways in which people may return to different kinds of work, the ways in which people may demand better work and more fair and equitable working conditions after or during, in the midst of, as we continue through the pandemic. As a criminologist and the director of the School of Criminology, issues about employment, work, and stability are central to our notions of what helps make healthy communities and what can reduce situations that we know can lead individuals to be involved in the justice system, to be involved in activities that would further alienate them in their communities. So this is an incredibly important conversation as we think about issues of racial equality, structural disadvantage, and justice. I'm pleased today to co-sponsor this panel with the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, along with the Institute on Race and Justice. I'm going to now turn the floor over to our long-standing co-director of the Institute on Race and Justice, Sam Williams, who will provide some context for the conversation today and introduce our speakers. So Sam, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amy and Jack, and welcome to, again, as Jack mentioned, a very timely and critical conversation that we're hoping to engage you in. My name is Sam Williams. I'm the co-director of the Institute of Race and Justice. I want to acknowledge Ed Powell and Holyke Vaisanen, who are also members of the Community Advisory Board. And we are leaders from various sectors here in the city of Boston and beyond Boston, who come together and have been coming together for many years. I won't go into that, but to really examine important social issues that are impacting families and children in real time. And so this is an example of a conversation that we're having with you and some experts around real-time issues impacting families, communities, and would really invite you to, as you're listening to the speakers and really thinking about these issues, bring your voices into the discussion when that time is available, because I think from this, we want to really try to figure out ways to move forward in solutional ways. So I'll stop there, but I have the privilege to introduce a colleague, friend, someone that I've known for years, and I think is an excellent leader, and I call him a trailblazer in this work of workforce development. He's the director of MassHire, Boston Career Center, and he's also the co-director of the Community Advisory Board here at Northeastern. And so I'd like to introduce to you the moderator, Mr. Maddrey Goode.
I want to thank all the folks who spoke before me. We'll start to get into the program, but I just want to reiterate what Jack said when we were preparing for this session today. Someone said if we could capture the energy and the spirit of that meeting, that we'll have a great session. And we really want to save time for questions and answers at the end. I see a lot of familiar faces out there, which brings me joy, but it also puts a lot of pressure on me. So welcome all. And I would like to start by introducing our panelists who will give some quick introductory remarks. And then we sort of have 4 sets of questions that we'll ask the group, and then we'll move into the Q&A. So I first want to introduce Dr. Alicia Sasser Modestino, who's a professor in the Northeastern University School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, and we'll hear from her in a minute. We also have Ms. Raija Vaisanen, Associate Director of MassHire Workforce Association, which I'm a proud member of as part of the Career Center Network. And then we have Mr. Ed Jordan. He is the employer and business owner on our panel today, which is very important for his perspective. And he is the president of Welding and Engineering, Inc. So with that said, Doctor, could you just give us some opening remarks to begin?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart and that I've been doing a lot of work on. So I'm pleased to join the panel here. And that was a fabulous discussion we had earlier. I'm just going to start off briefly giving sort of 3 quick takeaways that I see in the labor market right now. First of all, even prior to the pandemic, there were large racial disparities in both the quantity and the quality of jobs. So what do I mean by that? What do I mean by quantity? By quantity, I mean just looking at the unemployment rate here, which is what I've graphed for you going through September of 2021. You can see the unemployment rate historically has been twice as high for Blacks and 50% higher for Hispanics compared to white workers. And just prior to the pandemic, we had finally gotten to a point in the labor market where we had very tight labor market conditions and had narrowed some of those gaps. So you see those lines moving closer together right before that big spike during the pandemic. And even, for example, in January of 2020, women had accounted for just over half of payroll jobs for only the 2nd time in American history. But as the pandemic hit in-person jobs in the hospitality industry, retail sector, and even the non-essential parts of healthcare, we saw both gender and racial gaps widen again. So even now, the unemployment rate as of September, you see for Black and brown workers is 7.9% and 6.3% respectively, compared to 4.2% for whites. And we see these similar disparities even for teenagers, although at even higher levels of unemployment. So when the pandemic struck, it not only exacerbated these gaps in the quantity of people working by race, but also in the quality of jobs. So at the same time that a greater share of Black and brown workers became unemployed due to the large drop in service sector jobs in hotels, restaurants, and personal services, those that were fortunate to keep their essential jobs in grocery stores, big box retail chains, shipping, and healthcare were subject to unsafe working conditions, few benefits, and demanding schedules, largely at the same rate of pay. And like many other issues, the pandemic really exposed this ugly truth about the labor market, which stemmed from a combination of systemic factors that perpetuate inequality, starting with inadequate investment in communities of color, including early education, K through 12 schools and training, but also the location of job centers and transportation networks, in addition to outright discrimination. Now, unemployment insurance was important for filling this gap, and it was expanded to include more workers and at a higher benefit level than in the past. And this really helped fill in the gap for more vulnerable workers. And if we look at the claimant data for Massachusetts, that chart right there, we see that Black and Hispanic or Latino workers relied on UI benefits at a rate that was twice that of whites. We also know from other data not shown here that low-wage workers making less than $700 a week accounted for about 60% of unemployment insurance claimants. And so this, for example, would include grocery store workers, home health aides, Amazon warehouse workers, all of whom make less than $700 a week working full-time in Massachusetts. And people might not realize that UI benefits are actually designed for two reasons. You know, the obvious one is to replace lost income so that workers can afford the basic necessities while they look for a job. But the secondary purpose is to give workers enough time to search for a good job match and one that aligns with their skills and training. So workers need time to find a good match and also overcome any barriers to re-entering the workforce. Things like finding affordable childcare, having reliable transportation to get to and from work, which we can see the T was not always providing there, and ensuring that they're not exposing themselves or others that they live with to unnecessary risks. And that last part was really critical during COVID, since Black and brown communities faced higher rates of hospitalization and death from COVID that was twice as high as whites. This is in part, again, to a long history of health disparities by race that give rise to a higher prevalence of underlying health conditions for Black and Hispanic or Latino Americans. And in addition, higher rates of poverty among people of color mean that these communities are living in more crowded housing situations, especially in high cost living areas like Boston. And then layer on top of this, the likelihood of working a low wage in-person job. And you can see what a lifeline UI benefits were during the pandemic. Now, it's unlikely that businesses struggling to hire will suddenly find it very easy to fill jobs immediately. And we've definitely seen since July a slowdown in employment at restaurants, bars, hotels, despite employers offering higher wages and offering even signing bonuses in some cases. And that's because we know that UI benefits were really only one factor in terms of why people were still searching for a job. And in fact, among the 26 states that turned off their UI benefits early this summer, one study found that for every 8 workers who lost their benefits, only 1 worker was able to find a job. And as the Delta variant surged, people, really been wary about re-entering the workplace. And this has been especially true for women because the push for in-person school, along with no vaccine for kids under 12, has really meant a lot of disruptions for kids getting COVID, getting exposed to someone with COVID, or even just getting the sniffles and they can't go to school. So all of this has occurred against a backdrop where there was a surge in consumer demand after being locked down, which means we have a sudden shift in power from employers to workers, as Amy was mentioning at the beginning. And this gave rise to what's been known as Striketober recently in a number of industries. So who knows how long this will last, but it's certainly an important time to be thinking about workforce development and what investments can be made with the American Rescue Plan dollars that are coming out right now and for whom. So to talk about that, I'm going to pass it on to Raija.
Thanks, Alicia. So thank you so much for inviting me today. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Raija Vaisanen. I'm the Associate Director of the Massachusetts Workforce Association. And if you're not familiar with us, MWA is a statewide membership association that leads, advocates, and convenes on behalf of the Massachusetts workforce system. In my previous job, I was the research director at Commonwealth Corporation, which is the state's quasi-public agency that manages workforce development training programs. So this slide shows a graphic that tries to simplify what is a really sometimes complicated system of actors in the workforce development system. So the public workforce system, it's a network of federal, state, and local entities that work together to provide education and training services to job seekers and skilled talent to businesses to support economic strength and competitiveness. The public workforce system was initially developed through the 1998 Workforce Investment Act, which developed a state-based system organized through state and local workforce boards, which oversee one-stop career centers. Today, under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or what we fondly call WIOA, the public system also includes adult education, vocational rehabilitation, transitional assistance, and other state and local agency partners, knowing that, to do this work successfully requires good partnership and collaboration with our shared customers. The public workforce system works with businesses, educators, training providers, community leaders, and nonprofits. And specifically, it's designed to be locally responsive and demand-driven, which means focused on where the jobs really are, and serves 4 key populations: youth, young adults, individuals with barriers to employment, dislocated workers, or those who are unemployed or underemployed and seeking a change in their employment, and employers. Under WIOA, workforce development boards direct federal, state, and local funding to workforce development programs. In Boston, that's the Boston PIC, for instance. They also oversee the one-stop career centers, where job seekers can get employment information, find out about career development training opportunities, connect to various programs in their area, and serve local businesses. Maddrey will say more about this. Career centers are really the front door of the workforce system. In Massachusetts, we have 16 MassHire workforce boards and 29 MassHire career centers. The boards are composed of knowledgeable and influential business and community leaders who are appointed by the chief elected official for their region or their mayor. The board and career center in each region act as a resource to both businesses and job seekers. Workforce boards serve as the oversight and policy-making body for federally funded employment and training services in each of the 16 regions in the state. You might think Massachusetts is a small state, but we have really local sub-state economies. And so it's important for state and federal dollars to be implemented at the most local level, which can be responsive to employers and their needs. The boards also have a broader role of addressing critical labor market issues and developing strategic partnerships with local leaders in economic development, K-12 and higher education systems, government agencies, chambers of commerce, community-based and labor organizations. In 2018, the Executive Office of Labor and Workforce Development rebranded the Massachusetts workforce system as MassHire, just signifying the commitment to increasing meaningful career opportunities for job seekers and expanding the talent pool for businesses seeking trained and skilled employees. This brand really unifies and empowers all of the state, regional, and local workforce entities to communicate clearly with clients, like job seekers and businesses, with a clear message. Next slide, please. So Alicia gave a great overview of the economic climate we're in, and I wanted to give you a sort of sub-state view to where we are in the current labor market here. So this is a table of the top 25 cities in Massachusetts by pandemic unemployment assistance and pandemic extended unemployment compensation claimants, those programs that just ended September 6th. And Alicia shared information around the regular state-run UI unemployment benefits and that data. These were the new programs that were stood up by the federal government because of the unique nature of this economic downturn. The the pandemic being a public health crisis, and the government wanting to help people stay home safely and not feel compelled to go work in environments that would risk their health. So if we look at this data, and in a recent analysis I did of these, the PEUC claimants on the right, we see, just like what Alicia shared with the other population, the other group of unemployed claimants, more than half are women, majority are prime working age and likely have children. Many were people of color, and some from the hardest hit customer facing industries. So the majority coming from retail, food service, accommodation, and healthcare. So while these benefits ended in the beginning of September, we really only started to see claimants truly ending their benefits by the end of September, earlier this month in October. And in addition to all of the reasons Alicia already shared about why workers were still not re-entering the labor market, the child supply in our state is still only at 75 to 80% of what it was pre-pandemic. And at that point, we were also in a crunch for childcare access and supply. There's still racial and ethnic disparities in vaccination rates. And while children, we hope, will get access to the vaccine, like Alicia said, they haven't yet. So young children have still not been able to be protected in that way. And so, as you know, when we talk about seeing things at a local level, our MassHire career centers aren't seeing the flood of job seekers we saw after the Great Recession. This is a really unusual recession in that it's a pandemic-induced recession. And so while the number of job seekers is starting to increase, people are coming back to look for training opportunities and new job opportunities. And we're also seeing some employers increasing wages. This hasn't fully happened yet. So now I'll turn it over to Mr. Ed Jordan to offer his perspective as an employer.
We'll give Ed a second while he figures out. There we go, Ed.
I'm sorry, Maddrey, could you repeat that?
Yep, I was just gonna say, and now we're gonna get an employer perspective.
I think, I think in solution terms, and I think one of the biggest solutions that we can lean towards is, what does the various industries need? And unfortunately, there are so many industries out there, we can't really focus on all of them. However, we can focus on the ones with the highest paying jobs. That's one of the reasons why I became a welder. And as of right now, by the year 2024, which is just around the corner, the United States will have a shortage of welders by 400,000. The average welder is 55 years old. And whereas once that wave of welders retire, it's really going to leave the country in a bad situation when it comes to that particular trade. And welding is one of those trades that you can't build without it. So one of the things that I would suggest is that we kind of look at these industries such as welding and see if we can't bring these training components here to Massachusetts. One of the things that we wanted to do at Madison Park with the welding program, and unfortunately, it didn't go the way that it should have. We wanted to take Roxbury in Boston, the welding capital of the United States. Many years ago, the whaling capital of the country was Fall River and Taunton in New Bedford. There was never a shortage of whalers, even though I'm not into the thing, but the point being is how they were to corner a particular industry, and now you had those, those individuals down there who was able to do really well economically. So I think it's the same here, as well as with heavy operating equipment. That's an ideal job and an ideal program for men and women who are coming home, in particular, who have some age underneath their belt. They're still going to have to work for another 20 years, but they'll be able to do so in that piece of equipment comfortably.
Thank you, Ed. What I'm going to do next is just make a couple of comments, because at the Career Center here, we sit in the middle of government, private sector, and community. And I think as part of this conversation, we started with what are the things that the community needs to think about prior to COVID, during COVID, and as we recover from COVID. And one of the things that Ed mentioned was a program that we're doing at Madison Park around welding. When I first got to the Career Center 15 years ago, I formerly worked for the city of Boston, working with adjudicated youth. I worked at our workforce board, the PIC, and then I came to Goodwill, whose mission is really about finding work for folks who may have significant barriers and sort of a chance, not charity. But what I found is over the 15 years, the concept of work with dignity has changed. I was really indoctrinated when I first got here, is that we really focus on job placement, not such job creation, because that's a long-term exercise that may not get someone where they need immediately. One of the things that has come out of the pandemic, particularly for the Career Center, is that if we're not in the space of creating good jobs, then some of our people may never get them. And so part of that design, working with Madison Park, really around welding and HVAC, and I know the other Career Center downtown is doing something around carpentry and automotive tech, but it brings up an interesting concept that government will work with business to train folks, but we still seem to see labor shortages even prior to the pandemic. So one of the things that came up as part of our conversation in the prep was, well, what is the disconnect? I think the disconnect is really between government and business, understanding that there's different industries, like Ed mentioned, there's different requirements that certain industry needs, and there's certain things you can train, and there's certain things that folks need to do by experience. And so when you take these things together and you try to create programs in the middle, I think sometimes the community members who take part in some of these programs may not understand the full dynamics of the job, and when speaking with Ed, don't necessarily come out prepared 100% ready. Now, being 100% ready for some in government means that they have a baseline skill in order to do introductory stuff. But within the Career Center, I can tell you, while working with the pre-release program under the Department of Corrections over the last 4 years, there seems to be certain individuals who want to go right into work. I think one of the things the Career Center tries to do is get a good idea of what the labor market is, and then provide that information to the job seeker as well as the employer. One of the issues with that is that some employers feel like they're paying as much as they can, and some job seekers feel like they have all the skills and should be paid more. And so someone told me, I've never met anyone who felt like they were paid what they were fully worth, but there is labor market information that we provide, but some of it is more educational for individuals. And I think we're in an awkward time now because the expectations aren't meeting on either side. The perception that people were going to be running back in to jobs once their benefits ran out, I think really was the thought, but it hasn't been the reality. And so just understanding that in the career center that I serve here, 50% of the folks are African American, 20% Latinx. That's been consistent since I've been here. And one of the things that we're really proud of is that we've been able to increase the wages on average of placing 1,000 folks a year. And we only know that by following up with these individuals, is that the average wage went up from $15 an hour to over $20 an hour. But one of the things I did, and then I'll kind of get back into the panel and ask the questions, is in the last recession, I did something very important. I listened to people say that temp agencies and staffing agencies were mean, evil people. And so what I did was I went out and hired someone who was one of these mean, evil people, because I realized I need to keep certain folks closer and understand what really the dynamics are. And when I hired the individual, it was very interesting, really defended the staffing agencies, and then gave me this perspective that when we were a state trying to figure out how to have folks do internships, utilizing their unemployment insurance benefit, it came right to me that a person would be better off gaining work experience with a staffing agency, that they would have something current on their resume, and that they would have money. And one of the things that I didn't understand, and now I do, is that some industries rely on temporary workers as part of their normal business, and that not all staffing agencies are created the same, not all employers are created the same. And I think now the cause of social justice and transparency is difficult for us all to get around because we still live in a capitalistic society. And so with those dynamics, I'm going to ask the panelists one at a time to give me your perspective on the climate of the workforce prior to the pandemic. We'll start with Ed, and then we'll work our way back up the panel.
I think prior to the pandemic, especially in my particular industry, it was well. And we can see that because Boston is still in huge construction boom. And it's because of having such a large workforce that they was able to go ahead and, for the most part, start stockpiling other projects. In fact, they did so at such a rate that right now we're almost 7-8 years into the future when it comes to other projects. But fortunately, we no longer have that same workforce. So prior to it, it was very, it was very well. It was very good. Now, not so much so.
Thank you. I'm gonna pose the same question to Raija.
Thanks, Maddrey. And thanks, Ed, for your perspective too. I think prior to the pandemic, the conversation that we were, having, it was a tight labor market. In terms of job quality and trying to work with employers, as Maddrey was talking about, the conversations that we were trying to have as a workforce system, I think, were focused on recruitment and retention and how to make certain low-wage jobs more attractive, and not only through increased wages, but through other means as well. I was part of a project on reinventing work that is working with the Boston Federal Reserve, Commonwealth Corporation, and the Executive Office of Labor and Workforce Development. And I think, there was very little pressure, even in a tight labor market, for wages to really increase on more of the in jobs like retail, food service, in healthcare. And I think now we're seeing a different kind of pressure than any kind of tight labor market we've seen before. And so I feel like the conversation is more relevant than ever. And we've also had an experience of sort of universally seeing a lot of these low wage workers and calling them essential and really seeing them in a different light. And so now I'm hoping there's an opportunity that comes from that, the same way we were trying to take the tight labor market and use it as an opportunity too.
I'm going to ask Dr. Modestino to comment on that question.
Yeah, I'll just jump off right where Raija left off. And I think it's exactly right that we are finally seeing workers, low wage workers, and all of the work that they do, all of the challenges that they have, all of the struggles that we face. Because I think for anyone who's been in workforce development the last several decades, all the things that people are talking about right now during the pandemic are things we talked about for many, many decades. It's just that we only were talking to ourselves and it wasn't something that was widely known. And so the pandemic just kind of, ripped the cover off of what we suddenly were calling essential workers, as Raija said, what they were facing day in and day out, getting to work, doing a job that is physically demanding for low pay with very little benefits. And now like this great increased risk. And even then, very few of them got any kind of hazard pay or special bonuses or better schedules or anything out of it, even in the midst of the pandemic, because there was a whole other class of worker that was sitting at home demanding their groceries be delivered and all sorts of other services. So I think the pandemic, just exposed that. And what's really ironic is I think if you asked any labor economist whether we'd be sitting here right now struggling to find workers to fill jobs. If you asked us that this time last year, we never would have forecasted where we were. And so I think ironically, even though Democrats did not get $15 minimum wage passed in their big relief package, extending UI benefits and keeping them going as long as they did put a pressure on the labor market that we've never seen before, that allowed workers, it gave low wage workers the choices that other higher wage workers have had for years about which jobs to take, when, where, and how. And that actually has put upward pressure on wages like never before. And I would say before the pandemic, we were at a point where we were hopeful that we were in a tight labor market to be able to employ folks who had not been able to hold a job before. And I do a lot of work with Jewish vocational services. I know that they were moving towards a model of only working with quality employers, and they were developing metrics and an index to really be able to assess like who's a quality employer that we should be placing our clients with, and also starting to charge these employers for these placement services because they were so desperate for work. And now, during the pandemic that fell apart, but now, that's another moment of time where we think about workforce development, that we could again be in a position where employers are recognizing the value of having agencies be able to train, support, and place folks into these jobs that they're desperate to fill.
I want to thank you all for your remarks. And now I'm going to go with the next question. I'll ask that Dr. Modestino respond, and then we'll go back the reverse way. How would you describe the climate of the workforce now?
Yeah, I think at this point, people are calling it the Great Resignation, the Great Reassessment, whatever you want to call it. We've all been through something where we're thinking about how to value what we do in a different way, prioritizing things in a different way. And I do think that the length and the breadth and the depth of the government support that we had for the last 18 months gave, again, like low wage workers, that opportunity to be able to reassess what that might be. And so, a great example of this is when we reopened everything in the summer, right? So I don't know if you remember, but in April or so, Governor Baker said, well, I think if the vaccination rates get high enough, like we'll reopen fully, maybe in August. And then we did a really good job getting folks vaccinated. About 2 or 3 days before Memorial Day weekend, he said, hey, guess what? We're open. And all the restaurants on the Cape like freaked out because they didn't have enough workers to be fully open. And that did not cause adult workers to be rushing back to these jobs that, again, you know, low pay, schedules that are all over the place, people being rude, whatever it might be. And so what did they have to do? They turned to teenagers. It was the best summer ever to be a teenage worker compared to over the last 2 decades. And that's because employers were willing to train people in a way that maybe they never were before. They were willing to give an inexperienced worker a try. And so a lot of teenagers got their toehold in the labor market. But the summer before that, in summer 2020, teenagers, the unemployment rate was 30% for teenagers aged 16 to 19. And it was only Boston putting another $4 million of CARES Act money into the summer jobs program that gave them an opportunity that summer to preserve their skills, to find an experience, to get out of their houses after, you know, an entire spring of remote learning. And so I do think we're at this moment that workforce development has a critical role to play in this matchmaking, and that there is right now just a ton of money coming down from the federal government with the American Rescue Plan to be able to put into these programs like summer jobs and other training and workforce development programs that we know produce good outcomes for people, and they're just shovel ready for these things.
Thank you. Raija, you want to take a shot at this question?
Yeah, sure. So a few things. I think the pandemic has led to some things that we've been talking about for a long time happening much faster than any of us expected. So thank you. Sorry. Sorry about that. I'm in a library. The digital transformation and need for workers to have really strong tech skills has increased in a way that we expected to see in the next decade or so, and is really just right here, right now. The other piece is around age. So as Ed was saying, you know, there's already an aging. We already knew in many fields, manufacturing's one, some of the trades, as he said, and others, there's an aging workforce. A lot of people staying in jobs longer, needing to recoup retirement losses from the Great Recession, lots of other reasons to stay working. The pandemic really changed the calculus for them. I think the safety of certain jobs, there were already shortages of CDL licensed truck drivers, for instance. Many more left that field, right? It's not a super easy job, and it was also something that had to keep going during the pandemic. So the sort of health and safety of older workers came into play in a much faster way than I think we expected. And I also think that, like Alicia said, this is allowing workers to think about, be a little choosier. And I think a lot of the money that the state is now planning to put in from the American Rescue Plan Act, put to invest in workforce development, a lot of that is going to go into training programs, and we're hoping that we're going to see workers, you know, really interested in interested and able to take the time, as Maddrey said, to in some cases be paid while they're trained, and also take advantage of opportunities to increase their economic mobility.
So let me re-ask the question, Ed, so you can familiarize yourself with it. How do you describe the climate of the workforce now? And then what impact do you think COVID has had on the reopening of the workforce as well?
Right now in the construction industry, because that's really the only industry that I can really focus on, because that's the industry that I'm in and what I know. believe it or not, it's an excellent climate for workers because there is a shortage. For the most part, most of the workers they can pretty much walk off of one job and go right into another job with no problem. But again, we're talking about an industry of welders. So there's already a shortage anyway. So, they're worth their weight in gold. So it really isn't harmful at this point for them. As an employer, it's a nightmare. As an employer, it's a nightmare because you do have individuals who can just walk off the job and go somewhere else, and it's not a problem. I'm fortunate because, my company is one of the best companies to work for. And so for companies that treat their employees the way that they're supposed to, it's really not a big issue. But for newer companies, especially minority-owned companies and women-owned companies who are trying to get into this industry, it's really hard for them to develop a labor workforce because all of the good women and all of the good men are already taken. And so now they have to try to do whatever they can with whatever they got. And that's not a good scenario because once the companies go, the employees will follow sooner or later.
Thank you. And I know Ryan and I were on a conversation last week, and we even heard employers start to say, I'm not focused on timeliness. I'm not focused on attendance. I just want to be able to make sure folks, when they get here, are in a good spirit, and we need to be more flexible as employers to understand what's going on now. But I also think for folks who are more traditionalists in the workplace, it makes us feel uncomfortable. And I think employers who have sort of an old framework, that's not going to work going forward. But unfortunately, they have a lot of influence over government. And it goes back to that job creation and the middle skills gap that existed prior to. And it seems to still be there persisting. So I'm going to ask Raija to sort of what impact did COVID have on the economy as it relates to the workforce reopening?
So this is a question that I wish I was not going first on. I think that, and for the sake of, sort of re-emphasizing that this is a really different moment, I think, than we've ever seen, that this recession really is unlike any other that our economy has faced. And the fact that there are sectors of the economy that almost can't raise their wages enough to have workers come back, I think is going to force a lot of different changes. For instance, nursing homes. Nursing homes were the first hit for this pandemic, sadly. Many workers and patients were hit by the pandemic. A lot of workers left. Another workforce that has had a lot of older women of color working in jobs that didn't pay particularly high. They're desperate now for workers. They are lobbying for increased wages from the state as pass-through, because those are businesses that can't pass along the increased cost to their consumers, right? These are industries that are paid basically through Medicare and Medicaid. We have really complicated conversations that have been waiting to happen for a very long time in industries like that, where we really are going to have, I was part of a conversation with the Mass Senior Care Association, and they are really trying to think deeply as employers and as an association about how they can improve those jobs, find ways to increase the wages, because there really is no choice if they're going to survive. And these are jobs that require to care for some of our most vulnerable populations, right? We need people to do these jobs and to want to do these jobs and to do them well.
So, Doctor, can you tell us the impact COVID had on the economy as it relates to the workforce reopening? And then as the second part of that, what has remained the same both pre and post COVID-19?
All right, give me a two-part question. Okay. Well, I'll start off with a little bit of an irony here, kind of picking up where Raija left off. Nursing homes were really hard hit, but for example, the whole childcare industry was very hard hit, right? We closed down a lot of childcare entirely. Lots of providers went out of business. And now, we're left with a shortage of childcare slots. It's estimated nationwide we're going to lose 500,000 childcare slots. And that's, where there was a shortage before. So now it's an absolute utter crisis. And the irony of that is right now, even if we opened, 100 more daycare centers across Massachusetts, we wouldn't be able to staff them. And why is that? It's because the pay is so low. Why is the pay so low? People ask me this all the time. Why is childcare so expensive and the pay is so low? The pay is so low because it's a labor-intensive industry. You can't automate it, you can't outsource it. Anyone who's ever spent any time with a toddler or a young child will realize there's no easy ways to do that job. It's hard work, and you need bodies to do it, and it's regulated, right? So we have child to teacher ratios that you just cannot make it more efficient in any way possible. And so the other thing is that kids and families dip in and out of childcare because it's not affordable, right? So if you lose your job, if you lose some hours, right, you will immediately cut your childcare because it's really, really expensive. And so daycare providers don't have a lot of room to be raising wages to pay better. And so we've seen, ironically, that the lack of childcare and the lack of ability to staff those jobs is meaning that there's a whole bunch of other people who can't get to work. So yeah, if you've ever followed me on Twitter, you'll know childcare is infrastructure, and I'm going to say it 100 times, and I don't care. Don't at me. I will say it and say it because what we saw in the last jobs report in September, economists were expecting 500,000 new jobs to be created. Only 200,000 jobs were created. Where did the other 300,000 come from? Well, 300,000 women dropped out of the labor market in September. Why September? Because that's when everybody's supposed to go back to school. Oh, but it's in-person schooling? Sure it is, until it gets disrupted, right, by some kind of sniffle or childcare disruption. So it's having a drag on the economy. I mean, it's measurable. I just gave those figures because it's a measurable drag on the economy. We know that the administration is trying to stimulate this with either the American Rescue Plan funding. There's all these Build Back Better efforts and challenges that are going on. And yet it feels a little bit like we're making some of the same mistakes, where we're putting the cart before the horse. We're throwing money into industries and technology and all sorts of stuff and all these, what we think are going to be great jobs. And yet we're not standing up people to be ready to enter the pipeline, right? And so we have definitely a disconnect between thinking about, increasing advanced manufacturing or welding or construction or trucking or, biopharma is another great industry here in Massachusetts. And yet, if we want to get people even into the pipeline for the middle skill jobs in that industry, we need to be investing in them to be able to even get to the pipeline. So I guess that's how I would frame it at this point. And so what's changed, what's different? What's really different right now is we have a lot more resources, and we better figure out how to spend them wisely, and we better make sure that we don't leave certain communities behind, right? So we've seen in the past, the gateway cities get left behind every single time when we recover out of an economy where the unemployment rate is always 2 to 3 times higher in every gateway city. Well, it's time to make sure if you're going to invest in biopharma, you better be putting a manufacturing facility for biopharma in Lawrence, in Lowell, in Brockton, something like that. So I'll stop there for now. That's my rant for the day.
Well, I want to thank you for your rant, because a lot of folks want to rant with you, because I see a lot of head nods and head shaking. And I would say to that point, Raija, what do you think about the workforce has remained the same both pre and post COVID-19?
Yeah, so one thing I want to add to what Alicia was saying about the childcare workers and care work in general. And, these are jobs that are near and dear to my heart. I'm sure we all know folks who have been in these positions or we have needed these people in our lives to care for our loved ones. This is a conversation about race and reopening the economy. And I think it's important for us to realize that also part of why a lot of these care jobs are low are because they were traditionally jobs that were done in the home for no wages, unpaid labor of women of color, also for very low or no wages. And so there is a sort of, gender, race issue in terms of what we do, what jobs we value and how the market values them. And so I think that is also part of this issue. And I think something that similar to the conversations that we may have had, Maddrey, you and I have talked before COVID, there were some conversations that would happen around job quality, racial justice, and workforce development since George Floyd and the pandemic, and that there has been, I think, a deeper urgency among groups that may not have in the past been forced to really commit to looking at what these problems are and how we're going to move forward. And from a system perspective, like in the workforce system, how are we going to really examine the work we're doing to make sure that we are not perpetuating cycles of occupational segregation, and that we are really thinking about who we are helping into certain pipelines and into certain opportunities, so that we really do, like Alicia said, make sure that the opportunities are distributed equally, that underserved communities are getting access in ways that they have not previously. And I think the one thing we can say today is that at least that conversation is happening on a broader scale instead of just in small pockets.
And I think some of it, you bring up a great point, and I know the areas that we particularly focus on, Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, the South End, there's a lot of subsidized housing. And there's folks who've been sort of struggling with this concept of the cliff effect for years. And I like to think of it as an easy math equation. If it costs you more to try and figure out all these things versus being able to spend time with friends and family. And then there's also this perception of blaming the victim. And I think moving past those spaces is difficult because of who traditionally sits in those seats. You think about the airline industry, you think about farming. Those are always, always, always reinforced by government and subsidized by government. But when you get on a plane, you don't necessarily worry about the dynamics of it. You just know that you're able to fly. And they've done things in their industry. I can remember 10 years ago, a plane was never packed. You'll be lucky to get on a plane that isn't Trump packed. And if you get there too late, they won't let you on. And I heard that there's definitely overbooking going on. But back to the community. I think if you think of areas that traditionally, no matter what the economy is going through, is at 10 to 12% unemployment, it's always raining. And when it's always raining, you have on a raincoat. And then when you have on rain boots, it doesn't necessarily affect you as if you were just out there on a bright and sunny day and don't expect it to rain. And so part of this conversation is really an urgency to be part of conversations and really have a perspective of how structurally the workforce has really marginalized a lot of folks. And this is the time for the voices to be heard. And so with that, I'm going to ask Ed to, what have you seen in the workforce that has remained the same both before COVID and after COVID. And then after Ed responds, we're going to start to take questions from the chat. I want to acknowledge that Dr. Modestino will need to leave 10 minutes early because she's actually going to be working after most of us will end our work day because she has a class. And so I just want to thank you if we get caught up in the question and answer, and really thank you for bringing a perspective from research in a way that folks can understand and support in a way we can carry a message forward. So with that said, Ed, what have you seen before and after, and what has been the same with those things?
Well, sadly, before and after, there's still disparities in the treatment of the workers, as well as first hired or, last hired, first fired. That hasn't changed. And it's not gonna change until more companies of color are actually sitting at the table. And so one of the things that we need to think about is, how do we get these companies of color at the table? And unfortunately, going to the banks ain't gonna help, because banks only give you money that you already have. And I guess just recently, I believe it was Citibank, they came out with a commercial where they were saying, from now on, we're really gonna, treat small Black business with respect, and we're gonna, offer them loans and all of this foolishness, and, at the end of, at the beginning of the day, it's still the same. At the end of the day, it's still the same. It's not gonna change. And so what we really have to do, because that's a disparity that really needs to be corrected. So, and the other thing I found, and it's just historically, when people do well, everybody wants to get on board, or they want to tear stuff up, like in, Oklahoma with, the Black Wall Street. We're just going to have to take a chance and get another Black Wall Street going.
Thank you. Thank you. And so that was the last of our formal questions that the panel decided to ask of each other. And so I have folks who are monitoring the chat to see if there's any questions that have bubbled up. I also want to acknowledge some of the community groups we have today in the group. I know they've been pushing really hard. And one of the things they brought to me, this concept of owning a home is how you build wealth. But owning a home means you need money. And to Ed's point, you can go to the bank and ask for a home, but unless you have a pay stub that has enough money to be able to pay that loan off, I don't think there's any social justice you can bring in lieu of payment to that situation. And so I want to open it up to any questions. Or thoughts from the panelists.
Maddrey, there's a question in the chat. I'll read it out for you. Do any of you have a sense of how traditionally hard to employ populations, those with large gaps in employment, criminal records, have responded to these changes? I'm curious if any of these new opportunities to enter the workforce, if they need to exit the labor market for similar reasons as the broader population. That could be for anyone.
Jack, the question was about harder to employ populations and how they're responding at this point. Is that right?
Yes, Alicia, that the examples were people returning to the workforce from being, in prison or that, or also people with big gaps in their employment record that might not be the first candidates that people would seek to employ.
Yeah, I mean, I would be curious to hear from other folks who are, doing more community-based work on the ground, but my sense is that employers are showing a greater willingness to hire people with criminal backgrounds or people who have large gaps on their resumes. Like Maddrey was saying, people are even throwing the attendance thing out the door, which used to be a big thing in manufacturing. Like you could walk in, and as long as you had a good work ethic and you're going to show up on time, then they'd be ready to train you, but they're going to even throw out the show up on time at this point. I think the struggle is that it's not like those folks it's always easy to walk in the door in a particular place. And so are we making sure that those folks have the skills they need to be successful in those jobs? Do they have the supports they need to be able to keep a job, right? Everything from like really small things can just disrupt employment for folks who are living paycheck to paycheck. Your car breaks down, the tea is late or not working. I mean, who knows what it looks like outside right now with the weather, but you're late to work 1, 2, 3 times, sometimes that's enough to kill it for you. So I think that they're still facing the same barriers, but there's a much greater willingness to hire them. And so I think that's a huge opportunity for workforce development to be able to support those individuals because they do have this small window of opening right now where employers are desperate to hire. And so if we can just support those people, get them in the door, get them into a stable situation, that maybe we can make some inroads in these really, just intractable problems we've seen for the last couple of decades.
Any other comments from the panel? Well, I can say from my experience here at the Career Center, pre and post, that we work with folks at the Boston pre-release, and with the average wages increasing with our population that we serve, and I would say 10% is the reentry population. Unfortunately, they haven't seen any increases over the 5 years with their wages. And one of the things that was always a concern is no matter what, the job, they seem to come in at the entry level. Which if you're in the pre-release and you have the ability to get minimum wage versus $2 to $3 a day from the state to go out and do service work or community service work or work crews, I think they benefit, but it really goes back to labor market information and really equipping people with the right information. I think one of the saddest things in the community is that when we work with people here at the Career Center, they typically look for a good job, but some of their career interests, things they've liked to do when they were younger, they don't necessarily see that as something they can do as a career. And I think the one problem with having so many governmental industry sector programs, particularly within the career centers as well, what if someone doesn't want to work in that sector? And so one of the things that you'll see, not as a plug or a commercial, but in the community, our message is simple. We can help you find the right job, because that's actually defined by the individual, not by any external motivation. But it's really a conversation to make sure they're doing it with the best knowledge and advice, particularly around workforce. So I want to turn, Ed has a comment.
Well, especially with regard to returning citizens and their, being in a pre-release, because there's an issue in particular to that industry that's just horrible. When I was in pre-release, I had both my welder's license as well as my barber's license. And the correctional officers who was in charge of job placement told me he would never allow me to actually go to work in the union. In fact, he insisted that I go to work in a car wash, And so I had to get into this huge fight with them over them deciding that they was going to send me back to higher security because I refused a job assignment. And the thing that I told them was, while I was in prison, I went and got these marketable skills. And because you're insecure over the fact that I'm gonna be making more money than you are right now, that you wanna force me to go to a car wash. And so that's something that still goes on today. And unfortunately, because we don't have the, you guys don't have the information and the data, it comes off as if there are these men and women who are coming out of prison and, they're struggling with these, with finding a job, when oftentimes what it is some of these offices refuse to allow them to get into a marketplace where they can actually capitalize on the training that they received. And a lot of that just has to do with really this, that slave owner mentality, because they really don't see you as, individuals who are coming home. They're masters, you're still a slave, regardless of what you think. And that's something that, I've been, passionate about with regards to helping men and women who are coming home from prison and trying to get them into a better suited position. And you're constantly fighting with the institution. And I've had several iron workers who are still iron workers today. Many of them, have bought 2 homes, and they came straight out of pre-release, and they was able to, come to work for me. And unfortunately, even at Boston pre-release at the time, no matter how many times I went down there to go see the superintendent, they would never let the guys come to, come to work. They had to finish out their time at a car wash. So there's that authoritarian issue that we also have to address. We really do need to take their being employed out of the Department of Corrections' hands, because when they have control of it, they can stop you from getting into a good job.
And I would thank you, Ed. And I would just say before we go to Raija, it's about systems. And one of the issues is that these systems are structurally tied together. If you think about someone who may be a young person of color, who has a child, there is a probability that if they go to court and they don't find a job, they could get locked up. And at that point, there's not a lot of assistance for them to find a job, and definitely doesn't take their career interests into account. And it's one of the things that, to the point of structure, particularly in Massachusetts, and to Dr. Modestino, if you have 50% of folks who are people of color, who are moms, who are caring for children, then you have men of color who are disproportionately locked up in jail. You can imagine what this does to generation of people after time. And I think COVID has made this worse, particularly with the perception of social justice as a thing, but not necessarily a plan to disrupt all these systems that are connected together. And so I don't want to take thunder from the next series or talk that we'll have, but if you're interested in that, Jack will update you at the end. But to Raija, to comment.
Maddrey, I just wanted to, Ed's comments made me think about the conversation we had with some researchers recently at Northeastern regarding employers offering Corey-friendly work. And these researchers were trying to understand, doesn't seem like employers really advertise when they're hiring folks that are returning from incarceration. And I wonder why that is, and how could we get those employers to tell us what makes them hire these individuals, what are the challenges? And so Maddrey and I were thinking about the programs, like the program that Maddrey runs, others across the state, that are focused on helping returning citizens re-enter the labor market. And we said, you know, it's true, employers don't advertise when they're employing returning citizens, and therefore they're not communicating to some of their colleagues, to other employers, hey, this actually works. This is actually a good idea. So I think there's also that point around the finding a way to elevate the experience Ed has, the experience other employers have successfully employing these marginalized populations.
I think we may have time for one more question, or if anyone has, or we can turn it over to Jack to kind of close this out.
Well, let me ask one question. I know Alicia has to leave, but you've talked about how there's populations, workforces that have been traditionally represented by marginalized groups. And then but also how much there's a demand for workers right now. Usually that would spur increases in wages. Have you started to see any increases in wages among those occupations that employ folks of color, other kinds of marginalized groups? Alicia?
Yeah, it depends. It's a little bit spotty. So there is a general increase in wages that's going on right now, but it's not across the board. And so a lot of the increase in wages is, you know, in industries that can afford to pay more, you know, thinking about like manufacturing and things like that. We haven't really seen wages rising too much in childcare or even really in restaurants or hotels. Instead of wages rising, they're doing things like offering a signing bonus or like other perks, like things that aren't permanent. So we're seeing upward pressure on wages, but not a lot of action so far across the board. And I think that's why you're seeing, you know, Striketober happening, where, you know, suddenly there's actually worker voice. There are unions we're remembering. There are ways that workers can band together and negotiate higher wages and better working conditions. But still, again, those are only in certain pockets of the economy. And, you know, not to be really blunt, but last year during the height of the pandemic, you know, one of my big questions was what's the difference between a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old? Well, a 4-year-old could go to school in person and a 5-year-old was largely remote. Why? Because K through 12 public school teachers have a very strong union who were, you know, rightfully protecting their members and their working conditions, but early education does not, right? And so we just see these disparities all over the place. And why does early education perhaps not? I think, again, we cannot ignore the historical, institutional, you know, racial, you know, discrimination that's happened for years. When you think about early childhood, I mean, it goes all the way back to slavery, right? Where Black women were expected to watch after white women's kids for free, right, as slaves. And so, like, these things are just baked into the system. And I think Maddrey is right that we've exposed a lot and like we have really not changed very much yet at all.
Thank you. Raija, did you want to comment?
Amy has a hand.
Yeah, can I ask a question just really quickly? Thinking about that the same question seems to come up over and over again about wages, but I'm also wondering what other conditions about work may be things we need to address. So it's great if you receive a higher wage, but only if you're paid regularly and you don't, you know, your employer doesn't have problems getting you paid, or that you're not asked to work hours that are change all the time, or that are things you can't plan your life around, or you don't experience sexual harassment in the workplace or racial discrimination that's unhealthy to your mental health when you come to work. So thinking about the other ways in which our workplaces are safe and healthy places where people can grow and advance in this moment that we have, which may not last forever, but is a moment in which workers have more power to think about what they want out of jobs.
So I know that I've been working with some community groups, and to your point, Amy, Dr. Farrell, it's been, how do I become the only one if they want to integrate an industry? How do I figure out how to culturally fit in without losing my own culture. And I think best talking with a group, someone was really trying to diversify. And one of the things that is easy to view as a piece of change for employers is, has their mission statement changed at all to acknowledge that they want to bring in BIPOC folks. But one conversation is, we want someone who could sit at the barbecue and have conversation with everybody who's here. It's like, well, first and foremost, you may be having different conversations if you're a certain group versus other. And it's not incumbent upon that person to make you feel comfortable. It's really your company figuring out how to make individuals who have been marginalized feel comfortable, if that's true to your mission. And so to your point, I think job quality has so many factors to it, but folks tend to focus on the wages as the end all be all. But I think as part of the ongoing conversation is really, what does that mean for individuals? And then how can we have that conversation with employers particularly, and really highlight some of the best practices, which that's a touchy subject or touchy word or concept, but I think there are some promising practices that we could borrow from certain industries. But to Ed's point, there's certain things that you can't do from one industry to the other. And as an example, we have the HVAC and welding program that we're doing with the high school. There has to be a certain level of skill for folks to be in welding, because you can't necessarily take someone with no mechanical background, who's never been around sort of equipment that is dangerous, and just put a welding torch in their hand, no matter how many books they've read. But with HVAC, that has a lot more computer, a lot more studying, and maybe an opportunity for someone who hasn't had a mechanical background, but an interest. So I think for these things, and we haven't gotten to training versus experience versus retention, but they're all things that employers are struggling with. And hopefully the longer they have a harder job filling jobs, the more opportunity will be for folks who they haven't traditionally thought about. But I think between government, community, and institutions like Northeastern and great research, we have to have a great voice to sort of get these things in accord on behalf of the community. And is why I'm always glad to be part of the board that we have here, because part of the dynamic is bringing all these voices together. And for the record, I don't know if I said what Dr. Modestino said I did, but what Ed put in the chat, I think is appropriate. We exposed a lot, but haven't changed a lot. And I just want to acknowledge Ed Power as part of our advisory group as well, who's been doing this work for a long time and is one of my many mentors in the space to help me sort of stay right and get right, because these issues are near and dear to all of our hearts. So with that, Jack, did you want to close this out with any remarks and upcoming events?
Sure, absolutely. Well, thank you all. I mean, one of the hardest things about these Zoom meetings is that I want to stand up and applaud the panel at this point for all of the wonderful comments and insightful comments that they had. And we're all in our little Zoom boxes and we can't really do that. But I just want to thank everybody, all of the panelists, for your incredibly insightful comments. And I want to thank you, Ed, for challenging us to look at solutions as we started to have these conversations. Identifying challenges is part of it, but we got to think of ways to have solutions. And I guess for the Institute for Race and Justice, I'd say that when these dialogues are at their best, they expose the complexity of the issues that we're dealing with. That it's not easy. We can't just say, okay, everyone's going to run back to work as soon as their benefits end. But there's all kinds of other challenges that we have to deal with. And it's only by understanding that complexity that we can form the kind of solutions that will work, and not just say, this is the solution and this will just happen. And I think this was a wonderful example of digging down into the kinds of issues that are there to try to bring people back to the workforce with dignity, and how some of the complexities and challenges we have to deal with to do that in a way that is effective. And I want to thank Maddrey for helping to sort of lead this whole effort and move the Institute into this field and talking about that. I just wanted to say that our next panel is a further conversation about police and youth of color. We're going to have some youth who are working with the police right now in a program and their mentors. And in the past, these have been some of our most engaging and thoughtful presentations. That panel will be Tuesday, January 25th at 3:30. So watch for it. We'll be having more publicity around it. But thank you all for coming, and thanks for your conversation, and thank to all the panelists again. This has been wonderful. Thank you.